Let's now move to another view of the global system, coming from an insider in Washington, John Sitilides, who is also principal of the consulting firm Trilogy Advisors. John. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Platias, and thank you to Simeon Samokos and to all those who've invited me and my distinguished co-panelists here to the Delphi Economic Forum. It's a real pleasure to be here and to follow Dr. Platias's guidance and talk not so much about what's happening today, especially in Greece and your immediate neighborhood, but really to think about certain scenarios on the global scale of various levels of possibility and probability, but against the backdrop of what I see as increasing calls not only internationally for the United States to, quote unquote, stop being the world's policeman, but this strain we also see now in domestic American politics. And I know many of you are following very closely what's happening with the American presidential campaign and the state of disbelief that some of you find yourselves in, given where certain candidates have achieved, given the recent primary turnout. But I want to tell you that there is a growing strain of concern in the American society about the degree to which the United States, quote unquote, serves as the world's policeman, and every candidate, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, has said that the United States is not the world's policeman. So if we see a next presidency with either of these three candidates having a credible shot at the presidency, scaling back U.S. power projection worldwide, let's say specifically on the reallocation of naval assets so that not all of the world's sea lines of communication are protected by the United States Navy any longer. This not only affects, of course, global trade, commerce, energy supply, the supply chain for all types of consumer goods and finished products, but it also affects the regional designs of some of the powers that we're speaking about here in this group. So what I'd like to do is just take 4 different scenarios, play with them, and then we can talk some more about this during the Q&A. And I'll start in the Pacific Rim, where we see now that China has created a series of islands, new Chinese territory, or at least territory that China asserts territorial sovereignty over, in the South China Sea, several hundred miles south of the Chinese shores, directly contesting 9 literal Southeast Asian states' territorial rights. This area also sits on top of some of what many believe to be significant reserves of oil and natural gas, so there are long-term profits to be had here as well. But my sense is that China is looking to assert itself as a regional hegemon for legitimate reasons. We just noted earlier that China is the emerging global power, and in the end, it'll be the U.S. and China managing their relationship in a competitive or partnering context. And that remains to play out for several years to come. The issue is going to be, will the U.S. Navy defend the right of navigational freedom, or will it concede the South China Sea to China? And if it's the latter, what does that mean for the defense capabilities of other countries that are engaged in a rivalry with China? And I'll say first and foremost, for our purposes here, Japan, which has relied exclusively on U.S. protection against China and against the Soviet Union, of course, during the Cold War. But those of you who know history know that China and Japan have a centuries-long history of profound enmity. If Japan feels that the United States will not defend its interests against a growing power projection capability by China, does Japan become a nuclear power? And how does China respond to a Japan that now has nuclear weapons, less than a century after Japan committed the most horrific atrocities against the Chinese people prior to World War II, and the memories are very intact. And then we can talk about whether or not South Korea, which has a nuclear energy capacity, decides to pursue nuclear weapons as well, and what does the world do about nuclear proliferation in an area where half of the world's commerce traverses. We'll swing a little bit south now to the Indian Ocean. And we see here India becoming a major power in its own right, population-wise, of course, but also economically. It has the fastest growth rate of any major country in the world today, 7 to 8%. And it is astride an Indian Ocean that is often overlooked here in Europe and in the United States. But we have about 36 countries that are astride the Indian Ocean. Half of the world's container traffic goes through the Indian Ocean between Europe, the Persian Gulf, and Asia. 1/3 of the world's cargo goes through the Indian Ocean. And China is looking now to establish naval bases in conjunction with Pakistan, which is a historic rival of India. And it is already establishing facilities in the tiny country of Djibouti in the Gulf of Aden, very near a critical choke point that leads up to the Suez Canal and connects the Indian Ocean to Europe. So India sees China projecting power in the Indian Ocean. Does India look now to challenge Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean? And do we have a potential India-China rivalry in the Indian Ocean? And recall, these two countries had a short conflict several decades ago, and there remains a level of mistrust between these two great powers. We'll go to Russia and look to see what might be taking place if we have either a continuation of this regime or a successor regime that continues to weaken or attempt to weaken transatlantic resolve. We've seen this in the Ukraine. We've seen this in Syria. It began less than a decade ago in Georgia. And there may be other opportunities. One of them is in a tiny little area of Europe sandwiched between Poland and the Baltic countries called Kaliningrad, which is actually sovereign Russian territory. And there is a sizable pro-Russian element inside of Lithuania. And there are Polish-Lithuanian ethnic rivalries regarding their respective populations across their respective border. And what were to happen if, for instance, Russia would decide to push military forces from Belarus, a very loyal ally, across northern Poland into Kaliningrad, and basically cutting off the Baltic countries from Europe? Would the US and NATO respond? And is Greece, as a NATO ally, and other NATO allies prepared to potentially go to war with Russia over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? If we go north of Russia, you look at the Arctic Ocean, where we see that the waters are becoming much more available to shipping purposes as the sea ice melts in recent years. If one looks at the map of the Arctic Ocean, traversing the lanes between Asia and Europe, it is about 1/3 less time for shipping from South Korea to the North Sea. Now, this provides for substantial cost savings for shippers, for all those involved in commerce between Asia and Europe. So you have the possibility of Russia controlling the sea lines of communication through the Arctic Ocean, an emerging area of increasing importance. And the Russians have about 40 icebreakers to make sure that where there is ice, they can open that area up for shipping. The only potential other country to have any capacity is the United States, which has 2 icebreakers. The Obama administration has just put in a contract for perhaps another 2 to come online in about 5 years. And so Russia will dominate the Arctic Ocean shipping for the next decade at the very least. I'm going to close with one more area, if I might, and that's the Middle East. I won't touch on some of the issues that have already been touched on by my panelists, my co-panelists, but I want to bring up a different potential scenario, really involving an offshoot of what's happening in northern Iraq and Syria. And that is the opportunity for the Kurds to finally establish the nation state that they have longed for decades, if not centuries. Now, this requires, first of all, a cleaning out of the tensions between the Talibani forces and the Barzani forces in northern Iraq. And my sense is that there'll be some type of a push in the not-too-distant future. I don't want to say necessarily between the Persian New Year, at the end of March, and the so-called push for Mosul in June, but sometime in the not-too-distant future, a Kurdish military push to consolidate western Kurdistan in northern Syria. The long-term goal, ladies and gentlemen, is to connect what is now Iraqi Kurdistan to the Mediterranean Sea, a long corridor, a new Kurdistan nation along the entire Syrian-Turkish border as we know it today. So as Ian mentioned, we're seeing the dissolution of nation states. What will they look like? There's a very good chance there'll be a concerted effort by Kurdish military forces to carve out the entire northern strip, 10 to 30 miles across. And the issue then becomes, how does Turkey, obsessed with ensuring there is no independent Kurdish state anywhere in the Middle East, respond? If it responds militarily to protect its own interests, does it drag NATO into an effort to prevent a Kurdish state from forming? And does NATO want to become involved in an area where Syria is under the absolute air control of Russian forces? So I was signaled that my time is winding down, so I'll leave it at that and we can talk some more during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.